Hey everyone, Rick McElroy, Principal Security Strategist for VMware Carbon Black, and always happy to do these podcasts, these webinars with fellow Howlers as we sort of disassemble ourselves, go all over the world, and then come back together to Avengers Assemble to help people better defend their systems. With that, I'd like to introduce the other speakers on the panel today, and I'll start with Tom Kellermann, Head of Cybersecurity Strategy for VMware Carbon Black. TK, how you doing?
Good, man. Glad to be here. This is awesome. I love being on one of these with you, especially since, you and I thought up this construct of the Howlers about 2 years ago based on those books, Red Rising.
Yeah, we're gonna cover a whole lot of that stuff. But if you haven't read the series Red Rising, go read that. You'll probably understand the genesis of the name Howlers a little bit better and what we're trying to accomplish. Very happy to welcome one of our newest Howlers who's been out there really just crushing it. So everybody, welcome from the UK, James Alliband. James, how you doing?
Oh man, yeah, it's ready for the weekend, having an awesome time. So happy to be here as well, first and foremost. That's yeah, it's pretty awesome. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, and I'm as well. 4-day weekend, which is nice of VMware. They're just like, here's an extra day off. Love it. Karen Elazari, one of the Israeli hackers that I did talks with at Black Hat, right? And she came into Carbon Black Connect, and she's done TED Talks. She had the most eloquent way of describing the cyber phenomenon over the summer, and so I told her I'm going to steal it and use it for my talks. And it's really this idea that things have been a hot mess. And I was like, you know what? I like that technical term. I actually think it's not over. Like, there's going to be a long tail of things that we see, but I think it's important to not ambulance chase on the most recent attack that occurs or the most recent thing, because generally speaking, root causes are fall into the same buckets. But I think this webinar, we'd like to take a macro picture of those things, right? And so a few years ago, TK and I really started looking at the overall cyber picture. And we're like, how do we describe what actually is occurring? Is it cyber warfare, which I think is close, but where we landed in is around this idea of a cyber insurgency. And so the first thing I'm going to do is define how we talk about cyber insurgencies, and then we'll get into during the webcast, we'll get into how to counter this stuff, but sort of our flavoring on it, right? And so I'll start with the Department of Defense Joint Publication 102, which is the Department of Defense Dictionary of Military and Associated Terms. That's a long word, but of course the US government, if it's good for anything, is good for defining things with a bunch of words, right? So what is an insurgency? An organized movement aimed at the overthrow of a constituted government through use of subversion and armed conflict. But let's pull that into the cyber realm for a second. In cyber terms, it's an organized movement aimed at the disruption of cyber systems, and through subversion and armed conflict, actually taking control of those systems. The goals of the cyber insurgency, depending on the actors, may vary. However, the following conditions must exist for a cyber insurgency. 1, you must have a common entity or authority against whom your actions are directed. In this particular case, we're going to talk about Western democracies. You must have the tools of cyber insurrections themselves and the systems to launch attacks against the entities that you hope to disrupt. Finally, the cyber insurgents must be willing to use cyber force against their threats, and this element distinguishes a cyber insurrection from intelligence gathering purposes, which generally speaking get blended all the time. So TK, now that we've level set the field on the definition of a cyber insurgency, talk to me a little bit about how that actually plays out in the real world, right? Whether that's phenomenon from destructive attacks, phenomenons from moving from, to your point, moving from a home invasion to a burglary. Talk a little bit about sort of this macro picture and what's been occurring over the last 20 years.
Yeah, we've seen a dramatic escalation. Essentially, Western cyberspace looks more like Raqqa, Syria. It's a free fire zone with a multiplicity of actors. You're dealing with the challenges that cyber criminal crews and cyber spies have been treated like national assets by nation states, and they've been leveraging very sophisticated staged attacks that go beyond the Lockheed Martin kill chain to actually commandeer your digital transformation efforts and then use your own infrastructure and trust mechanisms to attack your constituency. And it's a cyclical attack cycle. I mean, Rick, you've highlighted this in the report we co-authored about, the cognitions of a cyber criminal. The problem with the Lockheed Martin kill chain, and even the problem with the MITRE attack matrix, yes, I said it, it's not sacrilege to say that, is because hackers are not animals. Okay, we can talk about all the behaviors, but they're not just instinctual animals. They have cognitions that generate behaviors. So how can you become predictive of future TTPs or future combinations of TTPs? And most notably, we saw in the research that we've conducted across all of our IR partners and all of our sensors that have been deployed around the world, that there's a dramatic uptick of what's called counter incident response, coupled with a dramatic spike in island hopping, where they commandeer your network, your website, your applications to attack your customers. And Rick, you're an expert on counter IR. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, look, I think this, I'm happy that we can see it, because it's probably been occurring longer than we had telemetry to actually go measure that. But, I think back to even talks that I saw, 10 or 12 years ago, which were really around the attackers want to shell on a system, and they want to interact with it, and they're going to do all kinds of different things. Now, back then, the big concern was data intelligence gathering, right? Like, they're looking for passwords, they're looking for these things. Now, if you look at recent work that Greg Foz and Marina and AC over on the TAL team have done, what we see is like they've moved from home invasion to like cyber squatting, and in fact, they're subleasing the systems that you think you own, right? There's 4 major dark web markets that handle what we refer to as the phenomenon of access mining. So this idea that attackers leave your environment once they execute their piece of code or get paid for their cyber extortion, I think is a false premise. And that's why defenses have to be continual. Like, you can't record data for a brief period of time and then hope to actually put the entire attack together.
And that's why it's a cognitive attack loop, right, Rick? I mean, that's why it's a loop. They constantly iterate. They're constantly conducting reconnaissance. I mean, the journey for ground truth for the defender needs to be extrapolated from the journey to ground truth of the adversary.
Yeah, so again, like the quickest way I can frame that for people is, typically people think recon starts with, an OSINT model, or previous attacks that have gathered data, or going on Facebook, social media, like really picking on the people so you can spearfish them and make that attack have a higher rate of efficacy. But really, like, recon is all the time, and so put yourself as an attacker. I land on an endpoint, like my piece of malware executed on a thing. I probably know the operating system, but I don't know the processes that are running. I don't know the defensive technology that's been deployed. I don't know the network that it's connected to. I don't know the DNS. I don't know the Active Directory system, and on and on and on. So I continually actually have to do recon as part of my attacks to even do something like credential harvesting or living off the land. Because the first thing I want to do is evade the defensive technology. So I need a list of those. I want to stop those from running. And on and on. And so I think what happens is, like, people think recon occurs on the left and then exfil occurs on the right. And I would tell you that in no way, shape, or form are these attacks ending. It's a total cyclical loop. But here's the thing. The good news for defenders is, because of the way the attackers have to attack us, right? Because of their cognitions, it gives us what I refer to as multiple at-bats, right? So whether that's initially stopping that piece of malware from and that tool from landing on an endpoint, whether that's the discovery of credential harvesting and/or lateral movement, and/or, now they're running around a bunch of systems using PowerShell. Like, you had 4 chances to stop that attack before it actually got to be something that was harmful to your organization. But James, I know, look, you're one of our UK howlers. Certainly, they're a Western democracy that faces a lot of the same threats that we do. So what are you seeing from a cyber ground truth perspective? And then how are customers, are they thinking about insurgencies? Are they thinking about someone else owning their systems and then using those? What are they putting in place to help with that issue?
Yeah, actually, one of the things that I've seen in recent times, and speaking to customers and speaking in the industry, is actually container attacks. And one thing I find that's really interesting is, statistically now 50% of organizations are actually running containers that contain known vulnerabilities. And it actually goes back to what you both said in that sense, is this is not the first time to identify this vulnerability, right? It's, fundamentally, this could be as simple as making sure that the Kubernetes and what it's orchestrated on, the container that's orchestrated on, has got a password in the first place. So when bad actors, for example, are leveraging the open API into that Kubernetes, fundamentally there, we're seeing an exposure point at that moment in time. And this is one topic that's really coming up a lot at this moment in time. And it's really opened up a new realm of possibilities. When we think about that automated process in DevOps environments, the actual exposure point really starts so early in the time frame.
Yeah,
James,
TK, I want to introduce real quick a couple of ideas that I think help frame insurgencies and counterinsurgencies. And for me, it's about shifting the mindset of the defenders, right? So irregular warfare, right? And I'll define that in the real world sense, and then we'll pull that into a cyber sense with some examples. So irregular warfare is a violent struggle among state and non-state actors for legitimacy and influence over relevant populations. In cyber sense, I would say relevant populations of compute is generally how you see that, right? Irregular warfare favors indirect approaches, though it may employ the full range of techniques, tactics, and procedures or other capabilities in order to erode an adversary's power, influence, and will. So TK, I know that from a nation state perspective, there's lots of nation states that have basically just adopted like irregular and asymmetrical warfare, meaning, business is caught up in that, all kinds of stuff. But talk a little bit about what that means from a defensive perspective to know that your adversary isn't operating off a playbook, to know that they're going to use any and all means to actually achieve their goals on objective.
Yeah, I mean, great framing of that question. So let's think about this. You've got transnational crime syndicates who have their own physical world armies, as evidenced by narco traffickers in Latin America, where I grew up, which continues to be a hotbed of violence, as well as groups like the Chinese triads, the Russian mafia, the Japanese Yakuza. All these groups have migrated online. At first, they used technology for the purposes of counterintelligence, and then they began to use technology for cyber money laundering, and now they're actually using hacking capabilities that they have dedicated business units dedicated to counter intel, money laundering, and hacking for the purposes of owning the digital landscape. And now many of these groups are obviously protected by specific regimes, but that being said, is they're allowed to leverage every and all capability they have at their disposal, so long as they pay homage to the regime. So this pax mafiosa, this protection racket phenomenon means even for those of you who think, I'm not going to be targeted by a nation state, well, maybe you won't, but will you be targeted by organized crime? Or did you just announce in your last press release that you may have a big government contract or a big contract with a large financial institution? Worst case scenario has shifted to essentially island hopping, your infrastructure being used to attack your constituency. What happens when that infrastructure starts pushing out destructive attacks because the regime tells that cyber crime syndicate, we want to see a manifestation of digital destruction here? And to the counter incident response point, it's not limited to, manipulation of timestamps or deletion of logs. These folks are reacting to the defenders, whether it's due to geopolitical tension or the fact that they're angry that you're trying to hunt them, by deploying wipers or ransomware in systems to punish you. And so frankly, this changes the way we have to defend. We have to be aware that whoever has just broken into our house is willing to burn it down. And so IR needs to change, cyber threat hunting needs to change. And from that perspective, Rick, I mean, you're the genius on these issues. How do we modernize threat hunting and IR to deal with an adversary that's willing to burn the environment to the ground?
Yeah, look, I always say to people, like, because I think when we have this discussion, it's logical and reasonable to explore the space of hack back, right? I don't think that's a good tactic, by the way. I don't think that's a good strategy as a business. I think we're drowning in alerts that we get now. So please, but I think it's a logical question to ask. Like, hey, at some point, if a large enough thing is hit that impacts enough human lives, does that require a commiserate, cyber response, right? I think that one of the areas that we have to think about, right, is okay, outside foundational security, which should exist, right? To James's earlier point, identifying vulnerabilities before they're deployed into production, and then having a rapid way to fix those. Like, those are all good things, and we're going to need those, right? But I think as it relates to battling an insurgency, like, we have the home field advantage, damn it, right? Like, those are our systems. I got to build them. I got to tell people the secure technical implementation guidelines. I got to go test security tools to put on top of those. But we forget that all the time, right? So look, one of the, I think, good things that we can do is start to waste attackers' time. Like, let's start making them, instead of being able to send out a 90% automated piece of ransomware that subverts defensive technologies, like, no, make them take manual effort and make it take a lot, right? So you're going to achieve one of two things. They're either going to move on from your environment, or they're going to have to go back, recode, come up with some new technique, some new tactic, some new procedure. But like, overall, we'd make them work harder, their ROI goes down. Awesome. James, framing how counterinsurgencies can occur, right? And I'm going to read you something that TK and I wrote as part of our initial blog on this, right? When counterinsurgents attempt to defeat an insurgency, they perform a range of diverse methods intended to counter that insurgencies. Leaders must effectively arrange these diverse methods, i.e. security controls, in time and space to accomplish strategic directions. However, the placement of those controls is only unique to the environment that they're deployed in. Like, generally speaking, the things you're going to need to do are the same. I think part of the issue is not enabling defenders to get together and speak. We're still kind of all doing threat intelligence kind of an old school way, and I think that needs an update. But from our customers and the teams that we interact with, like, how are they arranging their unique set of security controls to help battle this, given organizational requirements like staying up and running during a pandemic? And so what's the industry doing to, like, make this easier for defenders?
Yeah, and it's one thing that came to my head then is, as you're saying that, I think it's really important. It's when we think about advancing security and fundamentally how do we need to share context. One thing that came to my head, which I thought was an interesting point, is when we're trying to break down the silos, so when we're trying to share that context, what we actually need on the other side is to create the silos. To create the silos for the bad actors, so these insurgencies, so they can't communicate as well with each other. It's difficult for them to really break it down and to build that context so they can understand what they're trying to break into. Fundamentally, we as the good actors need to, as you said, understand our infrastructure, the context of our infrastructure. So leading into that, what are customers doing? What are we seeing customers doing? I think fundamentally it's making sure that they have that clear context of their infrastructure, and also making sure that they empower the employees. They employ when I think about what ultimately do organizations want, is they want to make sure their employee experience is its highest possible. So of course, at that moment in time, we've got to make sure that infrastructure is clear, the context is clear, we can share that context using the right tools in the right places, to ultimately make sure that we can break down those silos and really focus on what's important. That's the applications and data, which is fairly clear from that point.
And TK, I think another key concept out of countering insurgencies is this concept of unified action, right? I'll read the description really briefly, but unified action is essential for all types of involvement in a counterinsurgency. Unified action is the synchronization, coordination, and/or integration of the activities of governmental and non-governmental entities with security operations to achieve unity of effort. And the way I read this, right, and interpret it is, we've all been doing things, like, we're all busy, all right? Now, I don't go and talk to security teams who are like, yeah, we spent the last 2 months doing nothing, right? But I feel like sometimes, like, as a group, we haven't marched in the same exact direction, right? Mm-hmm. Meaning the controls that I have to deploy on my battlefield and then on in my home systems now, my corporate systems, all these things, I look at as like, that's unique and no one else has the same problems. So look, I think there's an opportunity for threat intelligence sharing and to make our ISACs a little bit better. and actually start sharing something a little more than IOCs, right? But talk to me a little bit about how defenders can start to build this culture of unified action inside of their environments. And then what can we do as, mouthpieces for security externally to help get unified action that makes sense?
Yeah, look, we learn a lot from advising the Fortune 500 CISOs of the world and interacting with the Western world's governments and intelligence communities. And what we're learning is that we're losing the battle, and that perimeter defense and defense in depth is failing against the threat of today. And frankly, that's due to two functions. Number one, we still believe prevention works. Prevention will not work against the more sophisticated adversaries who will target you if your brand has finally reached that level of prestige. So what happens when prevention fails? Well, you need to detect and respond, but you need to do so in a much more clandestine fashion, so not to get that reaction where counter-incident response or destructive attacks are escalated. So we have to integrate security controls. We have to create a new game plan for incident response. We need to inform our security decisions through threat hunting, but we need to expand our paradigm or stratagem across our information supply chain. That includes your outside general counsel, your marketing firm, your managed service provider, the folks that are building your brand new app or application, for that matter, that allows for functionality or service. I mean, just from that example, we see a dramatic spike in attacks on APIs for applications in the financial sector. And then, frankly, success is decreasing dwell time, but also containing an adversary unbeknownst to an adversary. And that is really the riddle here. So I'm looking forward to, for example, here at VMware Carbon Black, where we can do dynamic micro-segmentation specific to behavioral anomalies. That's hot. Or when mobile device management will be specific to the context of the threat to the user or the application being used on it. So the device will actually dumb down and limit functionality because it's under attack or it already has been compromised. That's where the future needs to go.
Yeah, I get real geeked. I mean, we did a Howlers call earlier in the week, right? And I get like real geeked about the future, especially for a company like VMware, right? So this idea that they already have 5 security control points, right? And then bringing those things together just to drive faster outcomes for teams, because teams are drowning, right? I mean, James, talk a little bit about what you see between current IT teams, current InfoSec teams. I mean, I still feel like we're not on the same team for some reason. I can't, other than it's maybe us, like in the history of InfoSec and IT, right? But yeah, what are we doing to tear down some of those barriers and then get folks like, IT system administrators on the threat hunting team, or to just better understand the threats and risks that their systems are facing?
Yeah, and it links in with the notion of XDR, of course, and really building that visibility, but also I think it all goes with empowerment as well. If we take the context of a vulnerability, for example, you got a vulnerability in your workload, and the infrastructure IT team, they're going to have to wait for security to inform them about the vulnerability, then to tell them to do something about it, and whether it's to patch that workload or whatever it is. So of course, at that point, it begs the question is, why can't they have that visibility? And of course, at that point, if you're aiding the visibility, you're empowering them to go and do their job, do it quickly. And of course, at that moment in time, you're actually breaking down those silos, because you're sharing the context, you're empowering each other to be able to do your jobs properly and be ahead of the game as well.
Yeah, I think I just look at those relationships and I was like, oh, and yeah, I wasn't always friendly with my IT teams back in the day, right? It's a learning curve, but I do think there's a spot for everybody from a unified action perspective, right? And TK, I think you nailed it. I think a lot about that home field advantage. I think a lot about, once they're in my systems, I can do whatever I want. Wouldn't it be cool if I could just spin up the same server that they're attacking, move them to an environment? They think they're still attacking my prod server. In the meantime, I'm coordinating with law enforcement, whoever else I need to coordinate with, so that we get better. And wouldn't it be even cooler if I could just push a button and then go change that state amongst all the servers that looked exactly the same way, right? And so I think, yeah, we're pretty stoked about the future for defenders. But I think going back to this idea of unified activity inside an organization, right? I need that message from the top. Like I need that culture to support it. I need all of those things. TK, kind of, as we're starting to wrap up this discussion around cyber insurgencies, you and I really love this term. We talk about it a lot. We requisitioned it, is the Marine Corps term. We requisitioned it from a book called Red Rising. But talk to me a little bit about Iron Rain.
So the book Red Rising is mandatory reading material for all officers in the Marine Corps as well as all CIA case officers. It's about an insurgency in space hundreds of years in the future across our solar system. And really this construct of Iron Rain is how do you actually attack an adversary with overwhelming force? And in this case, how would we be attacked with overwhelming force in cyberspace? And frankly, the answer to the riddle is they're going to use your own infrastructure to attack you. A worst case scenario now is island hopping, leveraging destructive attacks. Your infrastructure is now sending destructive payloads against your constituency. That changes the game. I think that argument in and of itself will finally allow for the CIO to see the light and have an awakening that it's fundamental for brand protection and for the protection of this amazing ecosystem that they've built to believe in this threat model and to begin to build security in and to have inside out security that looks a lot more architecturally like a prison than it does the castle that the standards organizations have espoused.
I like that. I like that, especially because in in certain prison models, like you don't know if you're being watched, right? And so your behavior actually changes because you don't know that you're being watched, and you just think you're being monitored all the time. So James, look, we're coming up on towards the end, right? But I wanted to give you some closing thoughts on do you have a big piece of advice today that defenders can get started around?
I think first and foremost, if I look at the last 6 months, for example, and really take that into context, ultimately there we think about accelerating security. One thing I would say is, take a look into what your security plan has been, how you have to accelerate that forward, because you've got to move quickly to the future. Ultimately we're living in a world today which is going to likely stay with us indefinitely, and that's a positive. So I've been talking a lot about turning these challenges that we face today in security and turning them into positives. Look at the remote workforce and how can we empower security around our remote workforce, and fundamentally not just look at creating the office bubble as such and building, as TK said earlier, around the perimeter, but ultimately looking at fundamentally building that defense on our, building defense around our employees. And TK, I really like the point as well, it's something that's close to my heart around mobile devices and mobile device management that dumbs down the device. It's something that I've spoke about a lot as well. Is how cool is it that from a user perspective, mobile devices, we see them as our device. We can do what we want in it, and we don't treat them like our corporate laptop, for example. We tend to take care of them in that human nature. But at the same time, if that device is attacked in whatever reason, what actual functionality do we require at that moment in time on that mobile device? And it's an important question because we likely maybe using our work device the same as our personal device, and when that behavior, the exposure is fundamentally so much higher to the user as well. So for me, I'm saying, well, actually, I want the device to protect me from myself at times in that sense.
Yeah, I think great advice, by the way. Mine's going to be, until we do it, I'm going to continue to say multi-factor, because stealing credentials is way too easy, and we just have to knock that off. Like most of the other attacks are enabled by having those credentials and moving around. So if you don't have MFA, really look at employing that and then put in some auditing. TK, my final question to you. You talk a lot about this. How can CISOs work with marketing to look at budgets and really look at securing this digital transformation as we're doing it?
Yeah, look, this is a brand protection issue. It's no longer a technology issue. It's no longer just a risk management issue. It's a brand protection issue given the phenomenon of island hopping. The same reason a restaurant, a hotel, an airline cares about your physical safety, especially from disease as well as physical threats in those environments, and they are responsible for that. That construct of safety needs to be expanded to the digital world. And in so much, you have marketing departments that are controlling 30% of corporate budgets and using a lot of that to extend the attack surface, ironically, by building that app or outsourcing that app or having the email campaigns or everything they're doing with the website that may or may not be turned into a watering hole soon. And so some of that marketing budget must be allocated towards brand protection. And look, see cybersecurity as a comparative differentiator, an opportunity to get a leg up on your competitors because you can show to them, you demonstrate to them, you care more about their digital safety in your environment.
Awesome. I think that's great advice. On behalf of myself and all the Howlers, I want to thank everybody for taking some time today and stopping by with us. You can follow us on Twitter at @the_Howlers. And we promise we only post great InfoSec info. Thanks, everyone.